Okay, hi everyone. This is the lecture on animal organization and homeostasis. Essentially, the first part of the chapter covered the different types of tissue in the human body. And then we'll talk a little bit, sort of an overview of organs, organ systems, and the body cavities in which those organs sit in. And then a little bit about the skin, and then homeostasis in general. Okay. This little intro, right, is the intro that's in the intro, or that starts the chapter. They always try to give a little bit of sort of real world relevance. And so it says the fact that astronauts need special suits to survive in space remind us that the internal environment of our body, or bodily functions must stay within normal limits, right? We've talked about homeostasis before. And so if you just think about homeostasis in relationship to body temperature, right? Body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius, which is listed there, okay? And that's because enzymes and proteins function best around that temperature. And so there's always a sort of push-pull or a dynamic equilibrium that's going on to maintain homeostasis in the body. And so body temperature is just one example of that. But hormone levels, right? There are a whole bunch of other processes that go on in the body that are maintained at homeostatic levels. Okay, it says an astronaut will depend on artificial systems in addition to natural systems to maintain homeostasis, right? Because that environment is so different, we have to make sure that internal environment is maintained the way it should be. Otherwise, your body cannot function physiologically speaking. Okay, so in terms of types of tissue, right? If we again, I think we talked about this back in like Bio 111 to kind of talk about levels of organization, right? We can talk about, atoms and molecules and then cells, right? And then tissues. And so definition of tissues is here. Collections of specialized cells, right? Of the same or similar type that perform a common function, okay? The four main tissue types, and of course, you should know the four main tissue types: epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous tissue. And we'll go over specifically each one of these. Okay, so we'll start with epithelial tissue or epithelium. And basically, in general, epithelial tissue will form a continuous layer over body surfaces, right, or line body cavities. Also, epithelial tissue will form glands, okay? In terms of within that tissue, how those epithelial cells are connected, there's various ways or different types of connections, okay? And the different types of connections are listed here. And it depends on what type of tissue you're talking about, right? So if it needs to be epithelial tissue that can kind of stretch more and be more flexible, it will have one type of junction, right? If it needs to be super, super tight and really more rigid, then the junctions between the cells will be a little bit different, okay? So we're not going to go too crazy into details with these junctions, but just understand that there are different types of junctions. We may talk a little bit more about them later. So tight junctions, adhesion junctions, and gap junctions. And so, like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about them, but I don't expect you guys to get bogged down with the details of these different types. In terms of general functions of epithelial tissue, right? Protection, secretion, because we said they form glands, right? Absorption, they're basically lining organs. And so if you think about your intestinal tract, right, lots of absorption will happen there. Excretion and filtration, you see them in kidney tubules and things like that as well, okay? So those are basic functions of epithelial tissue. Now, when you talk about epithelial tissue, there are different ways to categorize the epithelial tissue, right? So simple epithelia is just one single layer of cells. So you guys should understand these sort of different ways of classifying it. So one, again, just based on how many layers, right? So simple means a single layer of cells. But then you can talk about what those cells are, right? Or what shape those cells are. And so if you say something is squamous epithelium, the cells are flattened, okay? If you say something is cuboidal epithelium, then the cells are cube-shaped, okay? Columnar, the cells resemble columns, and they're sort of tall and thinner, okay? Now, if you then say it's stratified, that means it's more than one layer, right? So you can have simple squamous, which is one layer of flattened cells. You could have stratified squamous, right, which is multiple layers of flattened cells. So do you guys see how that those categories work? If you call something, you call it glandular, then that's epithelium or epithelia that will produce or that forms a gland, and glands secrete some sort of product. If you're talking about a sweat gland, it secretes sweat, right? If you talk about an exocrine gland, right, they will secrete products into ducts or to cavities. And so there are, pancreatic enzymes, digestive enzymes, right, that are secreted and sent into the intestinal tract. Those are exocrine glands, okay? That's the exocrine part of the pancreas. All right, so it says a gland can be just one single epithelial cell or it can contain many cells. All right, when you talk about an endocrine gland, these are glands that produce hormones, right? And so those products go into the bloodstream. Okay, so for the types of tissues, and so I said this before, I will give you a separate lab quiz on the tissues in which you will be identifying. So from a picture. So if I showed you this picture, you should be able to identify that it's simple squamous epithelium. You should also be able to tell me where it's found, right? And so my example that I always give is lining of the lungs, also lining of the blood vessels, right? So at the top, it's going to tell you where it's found, right? Name it, tell you where it's found, and then just a basic function, okay? So you should really know everything that's on these slides here. So again, if I showed you this picture, you should be able to identify this as simple squamous, right? These cells are flattened. That's the squamous shape. Also know what these are. These are the nuclei of the cells, okay? All right, simple cuboidal. Again, now think of this this is a cross section through a tubule, right? Or even if you think of here going through the ureters here, right? A cross section through, this is kind of like a tube that things flow through, and this is the wall of it, okay? And you can see these cells here are kind of plump and cube-like, right? Those are the cuboidal cells, okay? So again, where are they found? Lining of kidney tubules and also glands. What do they do? Absorb molecules, in general, okay? So again, simple because it's just one layer, cuboidal because they're cube shaped, okay? So we should be able to identify from the picture. Another example, simple columnar, okay? So where do you find columnar? Lining the small intestine, okay? Uterine tubes, they're there for absorption as well. And so you can see how these cells are much different shape than these cells here, right? They're kind of tall and thin. And if you look at the nuclei, you can see the nuclei are kind of oblong shaped. So that helps you identify what cell type. Again, it's simple because it's one layer. This is one cell. This is another cell, right? They're long. Now, more, right, examples here. So now there's pseudo-stratified. I didn't mention that on my other slide. We said stratified is more than one layer. If you say something is pseudo-stratified, it appears like it's more than one layer, but in actuality, it's just one layer, okay? And again, columnar, right? These are tall and thin cells. Where do you find this type of epithelium? Lining of the trachea, okay? And again, it's ciliated. See these things here, these hair-like structures? These are cilia. This lines the trachea, and you can kind of think for a second to yourself why it makes sense that this type of epithelial tissue lines the trachea, right? And what the function of the cilia might be. And so they're there to trap things, right? And so if we think about inhaling air, well, we don't want to inhale debris. And if we do, we want it to be trapped in the trachea before it gets down into the smaller passages of the lungs, right? And so that's what those cilia are there for. And so once something gets trapped, what these cells also do is they produce mucus, right? And so that mucus kind of provides a sort of stickiness, but then also allows you to cough things up, okay? Stratified squamous, again, it's squamous shape, flattened cells, multiple layers, okay? Lining of the nose, mouth, easiest to kind of, it says esophagus, right? Think of skin, okay? It's there as protection. Okay, so moving on, right? So those were all different types of epithelial tissue, guys, okay? So the next main tissue type is connective tissue. And so basic functions of connective tissue, okay? Establishing a structural framework, Transporting fluids and dissolved materials, that's pertaining to blood. Blood is a connective tissue. Protecting delicate organs. Think about your rib cage, right? Bone is also a connective tissue. Establishing a structural framework, again, think about bone, right? But also think about cartilage and tendons and those kind of things as well. Supporting surrounding and interconnecting tissues. Okay, again, thinking about tendons, right? Thinking about cartilage, thinking about ligaments. Storing energy reserves. So bone, right? Stores, well, why am I, so bone stores calcium, right? Stores minerals, okay? And so that's, I don't know if that's really what I meant here, but that's one of the big things is that bone is going to store minerals like calcium, okay? Defending the body from microorganisms, okay? If you think about the blood, think about white blood cells, those are your part of your immune system, okay? All right. Oh, I know why. This is what this is referring to. Duh. So storing energy reserves because adipose tissue, fat tissue, is also a type of connective tissue. Okay. So fat is essentially, you have energy stored in there. Your body can break down fat and actually generate a lot of energy from that. So sorry, that's what that's referring to. Okay. For some reason, this is not letting me switch slides. Oh, this is sort of in the wrong spot. So I'll just kind of quickly. To be honest, you don't have to really worry about this too much, but this is just showing you different examples of glands, okay? Showing you a simple gland, like a sweat gland, and then this is more of a compound gland, okay? Don't worry about it. It's not, really just simply, simple kind of only has this one sort of domain of secretory cells, right? Where a compound has multiple, okay? So sorry, continuing on with those connective tissue. As I sort of mentioned on that other slide when we were talking about the functions, it's pretty diverse, right? We talk about bone and blood all being, both being connective tissues, okay? So within these different types of connective tissues, they have specialized cells, right? There is always a ground substance or a sort of non-cellular material that's part of the connective tissue. There's also protein fibers that are kind of, that are in that sort of, kind of in the ground substance, okay, that make up the sort of matrix, right? So that's what this is saying here. So the ground substance is separate of the protein fibers, but really those two components make up that tissue matrix. And then the specialized cells sit within that matrix, okay? So some of these protein fibers, collagen fibers, okay? These mostly are for strength and flexibility. Reticular fibers, these are more thin. They contain thin, highly branched collagen fibers, but same thing, flexibility, right? Elastic fibers, these are more elastic, not quite as strong as collagen, okay? And again, if you kind of think about, different types of connective tissue that I mentioned, bone versus, or think about tendons versus ligaments versus bone versus blood, right? You're going to have a lot of differences in terms of what's in that matrix, right? And how strong or how flexible it might be. All right. So in terms of breaking down the connective tissue a little bit more, you have fibrous, supportive, and fluid. And I basically mentioned some of these already, or probably all of those. Okay, so types of connective tissue, same thing. If I showed you a picture here, we need to be able to identify this. Okay, so these two on the left and the right, loose fibrous connective tissue and dense fibrous connective tissue, okay? So this, you're gonna see this loose fibrous connective tissue. The reason why it's called loose is that it has more space in between, and you can kind of see this in between the components, right? The fibers that are in the matrix and the cells. Here, everything's really, really tightly packed, right? So you can kind of see all the nuclei here of the fibroblast cells. Mostly you'll see this beneath the skin and beneath most epithelial layers, okay? So it sort of supports and it binds organs. Here, though, this, which is much more dense and much stronger, is actually part of tendons and ligaments and provides support, okay? Here, adipose tissue, right? Looks like kind of fluffy, kind of white cells. Here's the nuclei. Basically the whole cell is filled with fat, right? And basically pushes the nuclei to the outside, okay? So we should be able to identify that as well. All right, hyaline cartilage, special type, think about cartilage, right? It says it occurs in the nose, right? Ears, cartilage, right? At the ends of bones, including the ribs, functions in support and protection. So you can, again, identify from a picture that this is hyaline cartilage, okay? And you can also see these are the specialized cells, the chondrocytes. Everything else, right? And then it's showing you sitting in this sort of cavity called a lacunae. Everything else is that matrix, right? Where you have the protein fibers that we talked about. Here, bone, okay? Again, pretty easy to identify. And I think you guys probably all agree that like the different types of connective tissue look a lot different, right? As opposed to the epithelial tissue, you can see that it could be easy to sort of confuse some of them. So make sure you spend enough time looking at these pictures and are able to identify, okay? So again, bone, and so you can see here the specialized cell is an osteocyte, okay? And it's sitting within something called the lacuna. That's essentially the cavity there. You can also see the central canal. That's where blood vessels will go through, and also nerves, okay? Because bone is a living tissue. All right. So if you talk about kind of just fibrous connective tissue in general, right? It's going to consist of fibroblast cells, okay, and some sort of matrix, jelly-like matrix that contains collagen and elastic fibers. And then the number or the amount of collagen and elastic fibers, how close the cells are together, is going to vary depending on what type of fibrous connective tissue you're talking about, okay? So we saw a picture of this already. That's talking about this, right? Okay, and just giving you pretty much some more information, but we basically said all of this in that other slide. Okay. All right, and so again, this is just a general picture kind of showing you the components that you see in all of these types of fibrous connective tissue, okay? So it's kind of showing you this all together here. So it's showing you some adipose cells, right? Showing you some white blood cells here, showing you a fibroblast, which is the sort of specialized cell, a part of the that connective tissue, really. That's the specialized cell that makes up that connective tissue. You can see here this ground substance and then these fibers that are running through. For the lab practical, I'm not going to ask you to identify different cell types or anything on using this type of picture, because I think it's a little misleading, a little confusing. However, if we're here and we have this picture here, we should know like that this is a fiber of some sort, right? Here's collagen, here's elastic. The collagen is thicker, elastic is thinner. And then this is a fibroblast cell. I won't ask you specifically what type of cell it is, but we should know the difference between the cell and the fibers that are running through, okay? All right. So now supportive connective tissue, right? Cartilage, we mentioned that, hyaline cartilage, okay? So a little more about that. And so again, it says it's classified according to the type of collagen. So we gave the example of hyaline cartilage. There's other types of cartilage, but we'll go with just the hyaline cartilage in terms of having to identify, okay? But just know that there are different types of cartilage. All right. Bone, we already mentioned this, right? So it says matrix is inorganic salts deposited around protein fibers. Like I said, calcium, right, is stored in that matrix. Okay. All right. So again, types of cartilage. I think it's pretty. I want you guys just to know that these different types of cartilage exist. The one that we're focusing on is this hyaline cartilage. That's the one that we need to be able to identify from the picture. Okay. And you can just see how these differ slightly, right? So here for elastic, it's more flexible because there's more elastic fibers, right? Fibrocartilage has a lot of collagen fibers, okay? So it's basically really strong, okay? So you find fibrocartilage in the pads between the vertebrae, okay, in the spine. All right. Bone, as you might imagine, is the most rigid connective tissue, okay? There's a really hard matrix of inorganic salts, like I said, mostly calcium, and that's what provides that rigidity. And then there are protein fibers as well, like we talked about, okay? Especially collagen, as you might imagine, because that's the one that provides strength, okay? Two main types of bone: compact bone, which will make up the shaft of a long bone, okay? And that's what's going to consist of those osteons. And then there are blood vessels and nerves that go through that central canal. If you talk about spongy bone, that's at the ends of the bone. And in there, there's space, there's air spaces, and that's why it's called spongy. And that's where you have red bone marrow, and that produces blood cells, right? All right. Another type of connective tissue, again, very different than bone, right? We're talking about fluid connective tissues now. Blood, okay? Blood is composed of red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets. We should be aware of the components of blood, okay? And what their function is. Red blood cells, oxygen transport, right? White blood cells, immune response. Platelets, clotting, okay? Simple as that. In terms of just overall functions of the blood, right? Transports nutrients and oxygen to cells, removes carbon dioxide and other waste, and helps distribute heat, right? Plays a role in fluid, ion, pH balance, right? Has a sort of multitude of functions. Another type of fluid connective tissue is something called lymph, right? And so this is fluid that's located in your lymphatic vessels. And so we often associate the lymphatic vessels or the lymphatic system with the immune system, okay? And so we're not going to talk too much about that, okay? All right, and so again, in terms of knowing the components. So yes, I can definitely show you a picture of blood. All right, I guess I would use something like this then. And you know, ask you, I should see if there's another. Oh, you know what? Yes. So I believe actually in the next chapter, yes, in chapter 32, just to kind of remind you guys, and I'll remind you when I do chapter 32 as well, there should be a real picture of a blood smear, right, from a microscope. And if there isn't, I'll make sure one is in there. But you should be able to identify a red blood cell versus a white blood cell versus a platelet from a picture like that. Okay. So like on the lab practical, I could have that picture and say, you know, identify what is this? Is this a platelet? Is this a red blood cell, or is this a white blood cell? Okay. So like I said, I believe in chapter 32, there is a picture like that. If there's not, I will make sure there is one is put in there. Okay. Because we do come back and talk more about blood then. All right. So this is just showing you, right? We all have gotten blood taken before. It goes into a, you know, this tube, right? A glass kind of test tube looking thing, and then it gets spun down in a centrifuge, right? And what happens when when you do that is you can separate out the plasma, the white blood cells, and the red blood cells. And from that, you can get counts, right? And to see how much, and you can kind of even just by eye sort of look at the percentage of plasma versus red blood cells versus white blood cells, okay? All right. Moving on to the next main type of tissue, which is muscle tissue, okay? Why is muscle tissue unique? It can contract, right? Contractile tissue. And those contractile cells, those muscle cells, contain actin and myosin filaments. The actin and myosin is what's really responsible for the contraction, okay? So the cells that make up muscle tissues are called muscle fibers. And they're called muscle fibers because they have a fibrous shape. They're long and thin. They're not round cells. All right, three main types of muscle tissue: skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. We should be able to identify these. I'm going to show you a picture in a second. From a picture, right, for the lab quiz. We also should know where they exist and what their function is. Okay, skeletal, voluntary. Okay, long striated fibers, and those cells are multinucleated. And then smooth muscle, involuntary, no striations. And then cardiac muscle, obviously you find that in the heart. It's striated, but it's involuntary, and cells are actually bound to each other by something specific called an intercalated disc. And I'll show you that. I'll point that out in the picture. And I'm just going to pause for 1 second. Okay, so just picking back up to finish off talking about muscular tissue or muscle tissue. Three main types, right? Skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. We should know, I'll show you a picture in a second, what each one looks like. Also know where it's located and what its function is. So if we look here, right, we have skeletal muscle, smooth muscle versus cardiac. If you notice, both skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle have striations, right? You can see them here, and it's pointed out as well, okay? You can see that these are right long, fibrous kind of cells, right? Long shaped cells. Here, this is the nuclei. And so in skeletal muscle, there are multiple nuclei, Okay, so they're multinucleated, and you can see the nuclei are kind of squished again, kind of to the surface, because it's really tightly packed with these myofibrils inside that skeletal muscle fiber. Okay, if you look at cardiac muscle, again, it's striated. You can see though they're not quite as tightly packed, right? And these are the nuclei here, right? They're not squished and kind of oblong shape like these. Also, they are not multinucleated, okay? These are the intercalated discs that I had mentioned before, so you should be able to identify those from a picture. And basically, those are direct connections between cardiac muscle cells, okay? So those ensure that basically ions can flow through there so that the entire heart muscle can contract at once, right? So all those cells contract in a coordinated fashion. For smooth muscle, right, this is muscle that will essentially be found in blood vessel walls, right, in the walls of organs, okay, and there is no striations, okay, and again, you can see the nuclei here, but there are no striations, okay, so single nucleus, same thing, single nucleus. Skeletal muscle is the only one that has multiple nuclei per cell, okay. All right, and here involuntary, right, versus voluntary. Voluntary skeletal muscle meaning moving your limbs, right, your arms and your legs. Involuntary meaning you don't have any control over it, no conscious control. These are muscles that line your blood vessels, like I said, that when blood vessels constrict, right, it would increase blood pressure. When they are relaxed, decrease in blood pressure, and so it affects blood pressure, flow of blood through a vessel, and what have you, okay? So again, involuntary, and obviously cardiac muscle is also involuntary as well. Okay, so that brings us to the last main type of tissue that we're going to talk about, and that's nervous tissue, right? Or nervous, so this is just mentioning nervous system functions, just to kind of introduce this, but the tissue we're going to be talking about is nervous tissue, okay? So just to kind of a reminder, in terms of functions of the nervous system, going to function in sensory input, right? So going to take information in. Sensory receptors are there to detect changes in the environment, also to detect changes, both externally in the external environment, but also in the internal environment as well. That information then gets transmitted to the spinal cord and to the brain, right? And then within the spinal cord and the brain, that data that came in will be integrated, right? And then a decision will be made in terms of what the proper output is, okay? And then if you talk about motor output, that's the response, right? And the response can be transmitted to a gland, right? Telling it to secrete a hormone, or to a muscle, right? Telling it to contract, okay? To produce movement, or what have you, okay? All right, so in terms of what nervous tissue or functions of nervous tissue, right? The nervous tissue can conduct electrical impulses. It conveys information from one area to another. Again, think about, feeling hot on your fingertip, right? And sending that information into the central nervous system. And in terms of what makes up nervous tissue, neurons, right, are the cells of the nervous system that can conduct electrical impulses, okay? And so they transmit information. I'm going to show you a picture in terms of the parts of the neuron. That is also something I'm going to include on the lab quiz, right? A diagram of the neuron to identify the parts, right? So 3 main parts: dendrites, cell body, and axon, right? So let me just show you that picture, and I'm going to come back to that in a second, okay? So here's the neuron here, right? Cell body, dendrites, and axon. You can see this axon is covered with this white substance, which is myelin, which insulates that axon and essentially allows for long distance transmission of the action potential, right, down that axon, okay? So 3 main parts of the neuron you guys should be able to identify. If I showed you an actual picture here, we should be able to identify, again, this as the cell body, these as the dendrites. That's where information is going to be coming in. Those are the receptive areas. And then the axon is where, information is going to be sent out. Okay, so let me just go back. Okay, and so, again, we just went over that as well. It says outside the brain and the spinal cord, fibers bound by connective tissue form nerves. So if you think about those axon, or that axon, right? If you think about nerves. Nerves are a whole bunch of axons together, and then there's obviously connective tissue around it that kind of binds them together. Okay. All right. So neurons are one cell type or one part of the nervous tissue, but then there are also supporting cells called neuroglia or called glia cells. And these guys support the neurons, nourish the neurons. And some examples of neuroglia, microglia, which are the immune system or the immune cells of the brain or of the nervous system. Astrocytes have a multitude of functions here. To be honest, we're not listing function. Okay, just know some examples of neuroglia. I'm just kind of giving you a little extra information here. So astrocytes, like I said, have a laundry list of functions, and I'll spare you those right now because we will talk about the nervous system in detail in a later chapter. Oligodendrocytes are also a type of neuroglia. These are going to be the cells that produce myelin. That myelin that wraps the axon is actually produced by oligodendrocytes within the central nervous system. Okay, so for right now, you don't need to know functions of these. You just need to know some examples, right? So if I said, or asked you to give me an example of a neuroglia cell or of a glial cell, you would be able to say an astrocyte or an oligodendrocyte or a microglia. Okay, so there's that picture again. This is showing you an astrocyte here, right? Again, the oligodendrocytes are what produce the myelin to wrap the axon. Okay, and this is showing you some microglia as well. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip over this again, just because it's interesting, right? But just in the essence of time, this is in the textbook. I believe there may also be a PDF on Moodle about it, but this is talking about regeneration of limbs essentially in salamanders, right? And this is showing you this salamander that basically is green, right? Sort of fluorescent because of this GFP protein that they used. Why can't I? There was a more picture for this. Let me just see something. Sorry. And so it just is describing kind of the basics of an experiment. Here it is. The basis of an experiment in which they did some tissue transplants and really were kind of studying how these limbs are able to regenerate in salamanders. Okay, so again, just kind of an overview. If you're interested in it, the actual article is in the textbook, and you guys can take a look at it. But I'm not going to test you on it. But so I don't, like I said, it is interesting. I don't want to really skip it all together, but I think we have to sort of leave some things out, unfortunately. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop there, and I will put up a part 2 of this, starting with organs and organ systems.